Hello and a very, very warm welcome to my YouTube. This evening I'm taking a look at a few tanks, starting with the First World War tank, moving on to the Sherman Firefly. The reason for the Sherman Firefly was because my father during the Second World War served in the 13th and 18th Hussars, and his tank was a Sherman Firefly. I'm also going to take a look at the American Hellcat, and initially when I started out with this film I was looking at the speed that the various tanks had capabilities of, and of course the First World War tanks were barely 3 or 4 miles an hour. When you move on to the Sherman tank you're looking at 25 to 30 miles an hour possibly, and the Hellcat was rated at 55 miles per hour as a top speed. Of course, many people say, what's the point of having a fast tank, and particularly with the Hellcat, because they would often be embroiled in columns, so they couldn't go flat out. And the same with the Sherman, going cross country on many occasions, they couldn't go flat out. But in any event, I thought I'd start with the First World War tanks. They're really interesting. My uncle served in the First World War, as also did my grandfather, who flew with 66 Squadron in Sopwith Camels. So hence there's a little bit of interest, personal interest there for the First World War, and certainly moving on to the Second World War, where my father served in the 13th and 18th Hussars, and he in actual fact went all the way across northwest Europe and completed his journey in Bremen, where they liberated the town. Little Willie was the first working tank in the world and is the oldest surviving tank today. It was built in 1915 by William Foster & Co. of Lincoln. To break the stalemate of trench warfare in World War I, the tank was designed by William Triton and Walter Wilson and was nicknamed after the German Crown Prince Kaiser Wilhelm. Official photograph taken of a tank going into action was on the 15th of September 1916. The tank is a Mark I with a steering tail at the rear of the vehicle that disappeared in many later models. The early tanks were slow and unreliable, shown by the fact that of the 49 tanks deployed for that battle, only 25 actually moved forward at the start of the attack. Production increased and reliability improved. They were used in greater numbers, and by the summer of 1918 they were a common sight on the British trenches, with around 2,600 tanks manufactured. As we've already noted, the British Mark I was the first ever tank to see combat. 150 were built, and they strangely had male and female tanks, each one mounting a 57mm 6-pounder gun. The female tanks, on the other hand, each mounted 2 cumbersome spontoons designed to carry 2 Vickers water-cooled heavy machine guns instead, with a tiny escape door at the back. Both had a tail-wheeled assembly at the back which could be used for steering and as a counterbalance when going over a ridge, or even additional support when crossing a wide trench. We're going to hear an interview with David Render, who was a tank commander at the very, very young age of 19 in 1944. And he's interviewed here with Dan Snow. It's a very, very interesting and enlightening chat with this very, very courageous David Render.
David, you don't look old enough, but you are a Normandy veteran, Western Europe veteran from 1944-45.
Correct.
What was your job?
I was a lieutenant troop leader of 5 Troop A Squadron, Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry. That's the Nottinghamshire Yeomanry.
How old were you?
I was 19 when I was in action against the Germans. I joined the army at 18 on my birthday, and because it was the thing to do, sort of thing, I did a year and a half. It took to train us from being a schoolboy to being, well, we were a man at 18, of course, to the being a lieutenant in able to command a troop of 4 tanks.
And what kind of tanks were they at that point?
Sherman 5s, yeah.
Fireflies?
4s. No, we had one Firefly later on, but immediately we had Sherman 75mm gun tanks.
So you're being sent over to Europe. D.Day happens. You land. When do you land?
I went over on D2. D.Day, of course, was D.Day, but the regiment went on D.Day. But I didn't know anything about them. I was just a reinforcement, and I took over 16 Cromwell tanks. And
so you land 2 days after D-Day. You take over 16 tanks.
Yes, to Normandy. Yeah.
Age 18.
Yeah.
And what's that like? Because you've got these grizzled veterans. Those people. We had a skeleton crew. I was a reinforcement, you see, and we went over just to sort of hand the tanks and the men over. When we left on D2, as I said, and then we floated about on D3 on a ship which was rather like a snake going over the waves. And we landed at about 4 o'clock on D4, and the first tank, the captain came over and said, "Get these." He used a very old English word actually to tell me to hurry up. And I said to the first tank, "Right, off you go." And he went down the ramp, and it went down and down, and woof, upside down, complete with the men in it, and disappeared. And we'd obviously, something had gone wrong, but I didn't know what it was. And the captain came over and he gave the most enormous ticking off to me for doing it. And I stood there frightened to death, really. We were, in fact, being machine gunned and attacked by Messerschmitt 109s at the time, just occasional ones whizzed over. And so it wasn't really a very nice place to be. I'd rather have been at home with Mum at that time, to tell you. So the first tank, did you lose the crew? Was the crew
Yes, yes. Only 2, only a skeleton crew. Normally a tank's got 5 people in it. But we were a reinforcement, you see.
But so that's your first command in Europe.
Well, you have to remember essentially one thing about all this, and that is that you're only talking to a peanut. I mean, I was only a little tiny speck, wasn't I? I was a lowly second lieutenant, a mere nothing. And the fact is that we only had our own little bit of the area to look at and see. I mean, we didn't know what was going on. I mean, I didn't even know D-Day was going on. Don't forget, when I got on the boat, the ship, to take the tanks over, I said to the chap, well, I was supposed to just put the tanks on and anchor them down, and I thought I had to get off and go and get some more tanks. And the chap said, "Get off." He says, "You better look through the porthole." When I looked through the porthole, we were at sea, and I said, "Well, where are we going?" He said, "Well, France, of course." Well, that was my invasion of France. I mean, I know you've got to have secrecy in war, haven't you? Essentially, you mustn't tell the other bloke what's happening. And so in the circumstances, that was secrecy gone balmy, wasn't it? Because I had no idea. And we just went to France, and that was it. That's how it went.
And then you joined a unit that you'd never
met before. And then I joined
I'd
never even heard of. And then the next thing was, of course, that the squadron leader placed me as the troop leader under instruction from a chap called Neville Fern. He was a lieutenant who'd been with them for some time, and he had to go and do something else. So on I did 1 day under instruction. You know, you hear about the fighter pilots having only 25 hours flying and all that. I had 1 day under instruction, and the next day I was in charge of the troop. I was in command of 3 tanks we had first of all.
In battle?
Well, yeah. I mean, but we actually fought. We did some shooting on D6 the day I was under instruction. The first day. And then, I mean, it was, but there's nothing very clever about it. I mean, it just sort of happens, doesn't it? You know, you're there doing it.
Well, I think it sounds pretty clever to me. So you're leading 3 tanks. Did you worry that they wouldn't respect you because you just turned up, or?
That was a terrible thing, if you really want the truth. The men I was with, it was a first-rate, front-line, well-known tank regiment, one of the best. If you read the history, people like General Horrocks says that the Sherwood Rangers were, one of the top regiments. And the fact of the matter was that these chaps that I was in command of, the sergeant, for instance, was totally hostile to me. He was 40 years old. He'd got a wife and kids at home. He'd had enough in the desert, but he'd done the landing on D.DAY. And to be honest with you, a whippersnapper of 19 years of age coming in, telling him what to do, wasn't on. And the fact was that he resented me completely, as did the men in the tank. For instance, the first thing we were taught to do as a lieutenant or a tank commander was to have the sights T&A'd, test and adjusted. That means that what you have to do is you take the firing pin out of the main armament, main gun. It's about that long, about as thick as my wrist, or just thinner, about my thumb, like that. And you look up, you go around the front of the gun, and if you look at a big gun, you'll see there are marks on it on the end of the barrel. And what you do is you get a bit of grease and a bit of grass and make a cross tease on the end of the barrel. You then go back and you aim the gun up until you see what you've probably read off the map, a church spire if there's one around, or something anyway, a target, whatever it is, 500 yards. So you set it at that. Then you go to the sights, which are next door to that, and you adjust those so that you adjust the sight at 500 yards on the side and lock it, you see, and lock them both. And then when you put a round up the spout, it fires. So I said to my gunner, this new chap I was with, on D7, if you like, when I was in charge, have you T&A'd your sights? And he said, what's it got to do with you? So I said, everything. And I want to know, have you done it? So he said, no, I haven't, and there's no need to either. This is a trooper talking to a lieutenant. So, mind you, he was much older than me. And so I said, well, I want you to T&A him. He said, they're all right, there's no need to do it. I said, I want you to do them. He just wouldn't answer. So I said, okay, I'll do it myself. So I knew I was telling a lie. The gun was aiming there and the sights were aiming there. They no more would have shot a tank than jump off the moon. So I put them straight and I said to him, now I'm telling you, that's the last time you pull that one on me. You see, time will tell. Oh, grumble, grunt. Well, the long and the short of it was, I had to fight 2 enemies. One was my own men, and the other one were the Germans. And the question is, my own men had to be dealt with first, so how do you deal with them? I decided that I was going to show them I wasn't afraid, because they were afraid. They'd seen a tank hit with their friends in it, glowing red, sparks coming out, and their men, their friends, are in there. And you see that once or twice. I'll tell you what, you're not too keen about getting in a tank again. Nobody in the regiment, by the way, that I ever heard of, there might have been one, but refused to get back in after the tank had been blown up. All our men always went straight back in, and so did we, because I came out of 3 altogether. But the fact of the matter is that it was a matter of how was I going to gain their confidence. So what I did was I said, I will lead. Well, leading was the most dangerous thing because the first thing that gets hit is the lead tank. But I led my troop all the time, right the way through. And after a bit, they said, this bloke's all right. And they wanted to be in my crew. The people wanted to be in my troop.
Well, as a matter of interest, the last tank here that I was taking a look at was the Hellcat, because it was the fastest tank of the Second World War with a top speed of 55 miles an hour. Some people say, well, what's the point of having a tank that can do 55 miles an hour when it usually gets stuck up in a column, or going cross country is going to slow it down? Well, equally it was the same with the Sherman. The Sherman was capable of 25 to 30 miles an hour, but of course cross country they were considerably slower. Of course, you go back to the First World War and you're looking at a tank that can only do 3 or 4 miles an hour. But in any event, the whole concept, certainly in the First World War, was a complete innovation to protect troops and to traverse the trenches. By the time you got to the Second World War, the sort of Cromwell tank, the Sherman, had become quite sophisticated for their time, and they did and served really, really well. I can only feel admiration for the crew that lived in them, because in all honesty, 5 people or 4 people in a Sherman Firefly spending hours on end cooped up in a turret of a tank must have been some awful experience. But they served the country well. My father returned from his service, and I would have to say, hand on heart, he was never quite the same person when he returned. Of course, PTSD was not known back in those days, but it was very sad. Well, I really hope this was of some interest, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. All the very best. Take care. Cheers.